Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me at the back?
Yes, thank you.
I might be small, but I'm fierce. My daughter gave me that plaque actually just the other day. So very often when I'm speaking, people are quite surprised that I can actually project to the back of the room. So hopefully you will hear. Can I just say that please use this time to ask any questions. There are no daft questions. The only bad questions are those that you walk away here and don't ask. So this is your opportunity. You'll get it all out there, talk about it, ask me anything. If I don't know the answer to it, I will certainly take it away and get back to Elaine or Libby, who can then pass information on to you. It's a very steep learning curve for a lot of you to realise that the Data Protection Act that you all know and love is changing. It's going to look and feel much the same, but it is going to have some big major repercussions for organisations that you really do need to be aware of. We have had now over a year to be thinking about how this is going to look in your organisation and the things that you need to do in order to change. So the scary thing is that we're now less than a year until its actual enforcement and implementation. Remember that it was actually enacted, it is legislation now, we just have a 2-year period of grace to the 25th of May, and as I say, that's now less than the 2 years, less than 1 year. One of my colleagues has actually got a clock on his computer that's counting down to the 25th of May, as I said earlier on, precisely the 25th of May 2018. So, as the regulator of the Data Protection Act, can I just clarify so you all understand we are not the Office of the Scottish Information Commissioner, we are the UK's Information Commissioner's Office. Sounds a bit like a Monty Python sketch, and I do not have a punchline for that yet, and I keep saying, after 10 years I must try and find one. We regulate the data protection regime within the UK. It's a reserved matter to the Westminster Parliament, therefore it's across the UK, it's the same piece of legislation. Freedom of information is what marks the difference between the two information commissioners in Scotland. Freedom of information is devolved to the Scottish Parliament and it's regulated by the Office of the Scottish Information Commissioner based at St Andrews. All as clear as mud. All you need to know is that I'm talking about data protection. We have put together our 12 steps to prepare for GDPR. That's the General Data Protection Regulation. You get to the point where that kind of rolls off the tongue now and you just think everyone else should know what GDPR stands for. But we do still get asked, what is that? I don't really know what that is. And I think one of the things first and foremost to talk about is the fact that it is a regulation. Our current data protection regime comes from a directive, and that's quite fundamental in terms of implementation in member states. And the reason for that is a directive has to be transposed by the member state legislature. That's not bad for this time in the morning, actually saying that, with teeth in and all. So what happens there is the member states can basically cherry pick, and that's what happened with the current Data Protection Act. The UK government cherry-picked what they wanted out of the 95 European directive from whence the Data Protection Act comes. I'm going to fall over this at some point, I know I am. So what that meant essentially was that there was no consistency of approach across the EU. There were fundamental things that were the same across the EU, but what you found was some regimes were more robust than others. And believe it or not, the UK's data protection regime is considered one of the less robust regimes across Europe. France and Spain and Germany being a case in point as being that little bit more robust. So what Europe decided was we can't have this. Europe, we need everything to be more or less consistent as much as possible. So in their infinite wisdom, they came up with a new data protection regulation. And the regulation is fundamental because what that means is it has to be transposed as is. From the moment it was enacted or enforced in Parliament in Europe, it became law in the UK from that moment. So that was in April 2016, it became law in the UK. And that sounds grand. You think, well, that's fine. We should all know exactly what it contains. The problem is, this is actually a bit of a hybrid. And there's around about 50 areas where they've allowed the member state legislature, that's twice, gosh, I'm doing well, the legislatures, that's 3 times, to transpose things like derogations or exemptions to come up with what they felt was appropriate for their particular cultures within each individual member state. Now what that means is that the UK government has still got to come up with the exemptions that are going to apply to this new regime. And somebody called an election. And what happens during elections? Nothing, essentially, by politicians in the UK Parliament. So where we were galloping along quite nicely and bringing up the UK government's proposals in terms of derogations, and some of you might have seen, it wasn't a consultation document that went out, it was just simply a document that said, here's the current exemptions, what's your thoughts, basically. So what they now have to do is to pick up the pieces, and I believe it's going to be the same minister that's going to be looking at this in the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, or the Department of Fun as we like to call it. So hopefully that's going to provide some consistency, and as we know, civil servants run the government anyway, so they've been beavering away in the background, and hopefully it's not going to put us back too much in terms of getting this legislation onto the UK table, as it were. We're looking probably at seeing a bill coming from the government round about maybe, I think they were hoping to get it before parliamentary recess, unsure as to whether that will be the case, but it will certainly be very soon thereafter if not. And then that means obviously it has to go through the whole process of legislation, which means that people get to say, actually we don't like it as it is, we'd like to throw in some amendments there, excuse me, perhaps a little less of this and a little bit more of that. So that then means we don't have something to be able to stand up here and say, right, here's the finished product, this is what you have to do. That was a very long preamble and a big caveat to tell you why I can't give you all the answers right now. And you may find me having to say things like, I don't know, or maybe's this, or maybe's that. And that's not my fault, honestly. I know the ICO can be accused of sitting on the fence very often, but genuinely this time it's not my fault. UK government have got to come up with this. In addition to that, as if that's not complicated enough, because this has got to be applied across Europe fairly consistently, it means that the European member states have got to also agree on the guidance that comes out on this. So you can imagine what that's like. You've got, 28 different cultures and mindsets trying to agree on what constitutes a high risk, for example, or what the role of the data protection officer should be. And that makes that difficult. And that guidance has still got to come out. So we have lots of knowns, because we can look at the actual legislation and say, here we are, we've got all of this in place. But there are also lots of unknowns as well, but at least they're known unknowns. If anybody's into Yes Minister, you'll get the reference there. Sorry, I'm so into my television programs. So I don't have a hooper-dooper for doing it with, but presumably there we go. Okay, 12 steps, and you've ticked off the first one already. It's all about, think also about if you're retaining information, about reading that information out. Do we have to retain, okay, you've got your staff records, and you have to retain salary information for HMRC purposes for your 6 years. But do you have to keep everything in an employee record once they've left? Or can you filter that out and only keep the things that you have a legal obligation or business case for keeping? So thinking very carefully about that. You begin to see now that there's a big job of work to get done here, a big job of work to get done, and that's why this has got to be up at the top of the senior management level within your organisation, because it has resource implications. You know, you as individuals cannot go in and do this on your own, I shouldn't imagine. You lead a team around you. There could be other people in your organisation that are actually more responsible for these activities, but certainly they need to know this is what has to happen and what's coming down the line. I don't know why I keep going there to press something. Communication. You really need to ensure that everybody in the organisation understands that there are changes coming down the line here. Please go on to our website, avail yourself of all of the guidance that will be coming out there. Think about how you can publish this and promote this throughout your organisation, and communicate to your staff that there are changes afoot. And some of the changes will affect you, as I said, if we're thinking carefully about consent, for example. That's a thorny issue, which is already a bit of a nightmare, is it not? When do you ask for consent? How do you get consent? Do you need consent? And that just becomes even thornier under the new regime. But communication is fundamental so that your SMT are aware of, as I said, what's coming down the line. They're aware of where you are as an organisation, and also fundamentally aware of the repercussions, shall I put it that way, of getting this stuff wrong, which I'll talk about later. Individuals' rights will change. Fundamentally, they will look and feel much like we have at this moment in time. So I'll still have a right to make a subject access request. I'll still have a right to request that my information is accurate, where necessary kept up to date. But a lot of these existing rights will become much more robust under the new regime. Subject to access requests will, I don't know, how many people here have to deal with subject access requests? Requests for people's own information within your organisation? Anyone aware of, one or two at the back, anyone aware of how many subject access requests your organisations get, say in a month? None. Never. You never get any. Gosh, there's a lot of health boards would absolutely, positively love to have that. They're inundated. But in the event you do get a subject access request, then the time frame for that is actually being reduced from current 40 days down to 30 days. We're assuming it's 30 days anyway. The GDPR talks about a month. And what is that? Again, no consistency. So what we're translating that as is 30 days is what we're down to. But the information that I can expect to receive is more than just my own personal information now in the subject access request. You need to tell me in a subject access request where you got the information from, if someone shared it with you, who you're sharing the information with, if you are sharing it outside, how long you're going to keep it, so that's your retention schedule, your legal basis for processing, which is why you need to identify that in your information audit. So you need to tell me your legal basis. I don't need to ask for this specifically anymore. Previously, if I wanted to know the source of information, I would have to ask for that under the current regime. I don't need to now. It's now expected under GDPR that you will give me that information. And then finally, you need to be able to tell people where to go in the nicest possible way if they want to complain. And obviously that would be to us as the regulator. The right to be informed, absolutely. You have to do that now, fair processing. I would expect to get onto your websites and to see good fair processing notices on there in the privacy and legal bits, or maybe to do with your cookies if it's electronic processing. Absolutely use your websites. Under the new regime, it's not just having to tell me this is what you can expect us to do with your information and giving me a rough idea. We may do this and we may do that. Maybe aye, maybe no. What's now required is we shall do this or we shall do that. And you need to be telling me why you're going to be doing that. Who will you be sharing my information with? That's part of fair processing notices now. How will you be storing it? How long will you keep it? How will you destroy it? Etc. All part of the fair processing that we want to see. Fair processing has got to be easily accessible to people, and it's got to be in a language that we understand. So how many of us, show of hands, how many of us actually read the terms and conditions the last time we ticked that box to say I agree with those terms and conditions? Just the data protection Anna back in the room. Okay. You do realise that if something was pear-shaped and you then come to us to complain, the first question we will ask is what was in the terms and conditions? And very often people will say to us, oh, I don't know, I never read them. So we'll go and look at the terms and conditions, and lo and behold, it says you have to give them your firstborn daughter. You've signed up to that. You know, there's nothing we can do about it. You actually didn't tick the box. It wasn't pre-ticked for you, you ticked that box. It's incumbent on you now to read the terms and conditions. You do realise the next time that happens, I'm going to be on your shoulder going, have you read the terms and conditions? Absolutely. And you do realise that I have to do it because I can't stand up here and tell you to do it if I haven't done it. I don't read every word. I mean, I would lose the will to live if that was the case. I don't read every word, but I know what I'm looking for. I want to know who's my information going to be shared with. That's fundamental. How long are you going to keep it? And how are you going to dispose of it at the end of the day? So it's those kinds of things that I'm looking for when I'm looking at terms and conditions. It's got to be in a language that's suitable for your audience. So if you are providing a service to a mixed audience in terms of either their ability to read and understand, if they have learning difficulties, for example, or perhaps an audience whose first language is not English, then you need to think about how are you going to communicate this fair processing message to that audience. It has to be clear, concise, and easily understood. Now that means you might have to have more than one fair processing notice if you are providing a service to a mixed audience, or mixed service users rather. So again, a job of work that you have to do there. You need to look at what you currently have, you need to look at the gap, and then you need to think about how you're going to fill that gap in terms of fair processing. I think the internet is great for being able to provide that in chunks, because, you know, as I said, we will lose the will to live if it's something like War and Peace, and that's not fair because that just puts you off. You don't want to read something that's masses long, but you should have it in chunks. So enough information, and then more information if I want to find out more information, and more information again, until I can perhaps look at the whole thing. Your website can provide links all over the place that brings me back to this is what we'll do, this is what we'll do, here's the privacy information that you require. It's just a great way of being able to get that information out there in chunks and in a nice accessible manner. And you can put lots of pretty pictures on it as well on the internet, that's what I like. So, right to be informed, right of access, the right to rectification. Now you've always had that right currently, but currently under section 14 in terms of accuracy in the DPA, your final recourse is always to the courts. That will continue. I mean, the court for the UK is always the final arbiter. However, our role as a regulator is more enhanced in relation to this right of rectification or the right to accuracy, in that we will now play or have a more robust role in getting you to correct information where someone is disputing that information. And remember, accuracy under data protection is all about matters of fact, not opinion. So it has to be a matter of fact for someone to raise that as an issue about accuracy with us. Whereas a professional opinion, we will not gainsay that opinion because we are not the professionals. So if you are a counsellor, for example, and you're expressing an opinion within a service user's record, but the service user takes issue with that opinion, what they have is perhaps a right to put in a note of disagreement to say they disagree with that opinion, but it's not a matter of fact. So disputing matters of fact, that someone's name is recorded wrongly, the day that they attended a particular appointment has been recorded wrongly, something like that would be a matter of fact. Certainly in terms of rectification, our role is much more robust, so you can expect us to be telling you to rectify things, whereas previously we perhaps wouldn't have done that. We would have said, well, you need to take that to court. Attached to that also is this right of erasure, or you may have heard about it as the right to be forgotten. It sounds like a song title. I'm sure there's a song in there somewhere. This right to be forgotten was in relation primarily to do with Google and Google searching, where a person's information from a long time ago was still searchable and findable, if that's a word, on Google when you did a search. And what this person argued, this was to do in Spain, this person argued that this information was no longer relevant to where they were as a person now, and it actually had a detrimental effect on them, and they won that case. And that's why we now have this so-called right to be forgotten. Now, it's very much qualified. Everything within data protection is always qualified. We have absolute rights to request and absolute rights to exercise, but we have qualified rights to have those requests acceded to, and also in exercising our rights, it doesn't mean to say that we will guarantee to have something done the way that we want it done. We are very much qualified, and is the right to be forgotten also very much qualified. And it's circumscribed around, so it's not every bit of information you have, and if you have a legal obligation to keep information, or indeed a business need to keep information, then I cannot exercise my right to be forgotten. That would just be contrary to logic, wouldn't it? Absolutely contrary to logic. So it's very, very much qualified. It's not as absolute as one might think it is. Another aspect, again, you've always had this right to be able to say, I don't want you to use my information in this way, or I don't want you to use that particular bit of information. But this is now about restricted processing, where I can come to you now, I can say to you, I don't want you to do that. But again, very much qualified around whether you have a legal obligation or business need to do things. So if I enter into a contract, for example, and for some reason I want to come out of that contract, and I then slap this right to restricted processing on you and say to you, stop processing my information for this purpose, you would obviously laugh in my face and say, no, you signed up to this is a contract, under contract, you have a legal obligation and we have a legal right to do this. So again, very much circumscribed by qualifications. And I suppose data portability is another one that you may have heard about, this idea that I have a right to say to you, right, I want all of my data that you have, because I want now another service provider to use that information, or I want you to pass that information on to another service provider. But again, this is very much qualified. We've had local authorities saying to us, oh my goodness, how are we going to do that? And we're saying to them, well, just hang fire. You know, what actual choice does somebody have about who does their council tax? None. It's going to be that local authority, so I can't say, well, actually, I'd rather you didn't use my council tax because you charge a wee bit more than the local authority next door, and I want them now to do it. No, that doesn't buy it. So legal obligations, business need, etc., and certain other restrictions that go around these particular rights in terms of data portability. It's more, that kind of right is more about, say, perhaps having your information processed by a financial institution who decided to take your information elsewhere because somebody else gives you a better deal, and so you want that information passed directly to another provider, perhaps, something like that. We've always had the right to object, and we also have this notion of automated processing, which is essentially just any machine making a decision about you. Anybody had that happen to them? A machine, essentially, a computer. The computer says no, the computer says yes. Put your hand up, show of hands. I'm only seeing a couple of hands here, but everybody in this room is liable to have had it. Have you ever applied for the loan, a mortgage, or have you ever, has everybody got a mobile phone? If you have a contract, you have an automated decision made about you at some point, because essentially when they run a credit check, it's an automated decision. It's no person at the other end of a phone or a computer saying, yes, Maureen Falconer is a good risk, she can have that contract. What happens is, something is punched in, information is punched out, and it says yes or it says no. That's automated decision making. If you're like me and you get to an airport and suddenly you think, travel insurance, forgot all about it. Quick, onto the internet, do a very quick, answer all the yeses where they want yes, answer all the no's where they want no's, and it'll come out and say, yes, fine, you've got your insurance, off you go, enjoy your holiday. If I put a yes where they want a no, or a no where they want a yes, I then become more of a risk. And the chances are I'll get to the bottom and it'll say, please contact one of our operatives who will be pleased to talk about your insurance with you. And then I'll speak to them and they'll say, well, actually, okay, having spoken to you about it, we now just determine, yes, you're a risk that we're prepared to take, so we'll give you insurance and off you go. And they might bump my insurance up and off I go. But that kind of automated decision making, we currently have a right, if we ask about it, to know about that and to say, well, actually, I'm not happy the fact that computer said no. I would like a person now to go and review that decision. And that right is made more robust under GDPR. That will come into sharp relief for you if anybody engages in some kind of fundraising or marketing, where you're doing a profiling. You've perhaps seen on our website the fines that we recently issued to charities in relation to wealth profiling. So if anybody engages in that kind of activity, then that will very definitely come under the automated decision making in terms of profiling. So it's essentially where you're using computers to work out someone's wealth and whether or not you can approach them to be a donor or contributor to your organisation. So any charities that are working under you, then very definitely they need to know that that's activity, very, very dodgy activity to get into from a data protection respect. So more robust rights and some new rights. Subject access requests I've already spoken about. Some of you that's not really an issue, but you need to know about it. Because that time frame has been shortened, even although you perhaps never had a subject access request come up and bite you, you should have processes within your organisation to deal with them in the event that you do get one, so that you actually recognise one. It doesn't have to say, currently, under Section 7 of the Data Protection Act, I'm exercising my right to request a copy of my personal information. It doesn't need to say that. It could say, under freedom of information, I want my personal information. Would you get it under freedom of information? Why wouldn't you get it under freedom of information from you guys?
Not public bodies.
Exactly. You're not public bodies, so freedom of information doesn't apply to you. So what would you do if you got a request like that? Would you just go back and say, no, it doesn't apply, you're not getting it? No. Hopefully what you would do is be a bit more helpful and say, actually, FOI doesn't apply, but what you're asking for is your own personal data, and that's under the data protection regime, so you're going to get it under that, or not, depending if you decide. And remember that there will be exemptions that you can apply, they will continue. We don't know what they are yet, because UK government is still to do that, but they're likely to be around the same type of exemptions that we have at the moment. So where, for example, it might cause distress or detriment, real distress or detriment to another individual, or maybe you shouldn't be giving the information out. But it has certainly got to be profile in your organisation so you know how to handle it. Legal basis, and in this I'm going to talk about consent. So, how many of you basically rely on consent to process personal information of your service users? Is that what you call people in the community? No? 1, 2 rely on consent. Oh, more than that. So, anyone else, what do you rely on? If it's not consent. Don't know. Okay, well I've already highlighted why you're going to have to know what basis you are using personal information on under GDPR, because it will have to be in your fair processing, it will have to be in any subject access request response that you give me, so you really do need to go and find out. So you've now got your information audit that you need to go and do, and I've said to you already why you need this legal basis, and one of the main reasons is because if at any point there's a perceived imbalance of power between your organisation and, can I use the term service user? Is that okay?
No, we don't have service users. We work with organisations mostly.
Okay, well it's sorry?
Volunteers.
Volunteers,
Yeah.
okay, yeah, if you have volunteers, then if you're not relying on consent, then the processing has to be necessary, first and foremost. It's a two-step test, if you like. It must be necessary, and then it must be for specific purposes as laid out in the General Data Protection Regulation. So you absolutely have got to know what the legal basis is of your processing. If at any point you are actually going to use information in any event, then you do not ask for consent, first and foremost. You need to be looking at one of the other conditions of processing. And this imbalance of power is, okay, perhaps not relevant to you, but certainly if you think about a local authority, if you think about social work services, for example, where consent is relied upon quite a lot, spuriously, in my view, but it's relied upon quite a lot, then there's very definitely a potential imbalance of power there between service users and social workers. Service users who may feel, oh, if I say no to this, then that might look bad on me for some reason, therefore I feel pressurised, no matter how little that pressure is, into saying yes here. So the basis on which you can actually use consent is changing quite dramatically for some organisations, perhaps not for you. But if you're providing information to any other third sector organisations who do provide those kinds of services, perhaps counselling, something like that, then you need to be able to advise them accordingly. So legal basis is being circumscribed, as I say, quite dramatically for public authorities and perhaps not so much for you. I've spoken about the consent issue. You really do need to be thinking very, very carefully about how you do this. One of the biggest differences, probably the most fundamental difference between the two regimes, is currently you have to comply. From the 25th of May, you have to evidence that compliance. And that's quite a fundamental difference there. That means you need to be able to, if we come knocking on the door, you need to be able to say, this is how we got consent, for example. So you need to think about that process. If you are relying on consent, if you're working with volunteers, and you're going to be using their personal information, you need to think about, how did we get consent? Did we have to rely on consent? If not, what was the legal basis? And remember, if you are relying on consent, then that means I have the right to say, actually, stop processing my information. I no longer give you my consent. And I have the ability to withdraw it as easily as to give it. What it means also is pre-ticked boxes, you know, those horrible ones, pre-ticked boxes, and silence will no longer be acceptable as forms of consent or evidencing consent. It has to be an affirmative, proactive action on the part of the individual concerned. So I have to opt in, the so-called soft opt-in, where you tell me, unless you tell us otherwise, we'll do X, Y, and Z by such and such a date. And you get nothing back from me, the assumption is that I've consented. But as we've always said, you know, a failure to object doesn't equate to consent. And the GDPR absolutely endorses that view. So pre-tick boxes, no longer acceptable. Silence, no longer acceptable. If you're relying on consent, it has to be really given, fully informed, unambiguous, and as easy to withdraw as it is to give. So I shouldn't have to go around the houses in order to find out how to withdraw my consent. If you have newsletters, for example, you're currently required, if you're doing that electronically, to provide an unsubscribe or a stop if it's texting to the people that you're sending that out to. And that comes into sharper relief under this regime. If you have, or you do send out newsletters, you need to think carefully about the basis on which you do that currently. If that's going out to individuals as opposed to organisations, then again you're looking at probably a consensual basis. I can't think of any other reason other than consent to be doing something like that. And so you need to look, how am I doing that just now? What's the basis on which I'm doing that now? Does it stand up to what GDPR requires? And if the answer to that is no, then you need to use what powers you can rely on now to refresh those consents. Certainly, GDPR does not require you to refresh every consent, but you do need to go and review them. And where you think, actually, I don't think this does comply with GDPR, you need to use, as I say, your powers that you currently have now in order to do that. Does anybody work with children as part of what you do? Can I ask in what way?
Work with the Saltire Awards and run projects over a period of weeks, different things. None at the moment, but we do work with children, and we've just actually had an issue with a primary school who are kind of struggling with the concept of giving us the information that we need for Milo. And that's the first in 5 years since Saltire was come in that nobody's. It's only the guides that actually asked us what we, what is our data protection policy. In terms of which is great. They asked us and we told them. Nobody else, no schools or anything has even asked, but this school has said no, we'll send you a list of names, list of their hours enough for their award, but unfortunately we don't want to send you. So I thought I'd wait till you come here and then respond to them.
The Saltire Awards is a youth volunteering recognition award, and it starts from age 12, and TSI will receive information about young volunteers, and they will use that to process Saltire certificates to give those young volunteers. There's personal information that's been exchanged in relation to
the difference in this is a primary school, so these wouldn't be Saltire Awards, these would be volunteers, but they were volunteers as were the ones in the secondary school, so we wanted to include them as well. And the school was just, I don't believe they're being difficult at all, I think they're just struggling.
Well, currently, what's the age for children in terms of consent? At what age can children exercise their own rights? in terms of consent?
12.
What, we've got a 12, we've got a 16, 13. Sorry?
13.
13 you said. So we've got 12, 13 and 16. Any other takers?
I think it's 16 because I'm trying to consent to everything at 12.
For data protection terms, it's assumed that capacity and understanding is such at 12 that people can exercise their own rights from data protection terms. Under GDPR, it's set out specifically at 16. However, the member states have the ability, that's one of the things that member states can actually decide to reduce or even make higher. And certainly the UK government did ask that very question, do you think that 16 is appropriate, or should it come down, in Scotland it's been 12, should it come down 13, I think is the European level, so should it come down to 13, or should it be somewhere in between, or should it even be up at 18, is the question that's being asked. So currently we don't know how this is going to look, but certainly we can assume 16 because that's what GDPR says. But it would be interesting that come the 25th of May, there's that gap between currently children and young people who have capacity to understand from age 12 can exercise their rights, but come the 25th of May, if that changes, it will be 16, which doesn't seem fair in my mind that you're kind of taking a section of society and saying you've no longer got that right to do that. So it'll be interesting to see what UK government comes out with. I don't know the results of that consultation at all. In terms of the school passing information, certainly it's all about necessity. If they don't rely on consent, it's about necessity. So it has to be necessary first, and then it could be in their legitimate interests, in your legitimate interest to receive it and not prejudicial to the rights and freedoms of the individuals concerned, which I should have thought this would be. But there is nothing in the Data Protection Act currently, or what's coming down the line, that will compel the release of information from any organisation other than an order of the court. So the Data Protection Act is all about permissive. It's things that allows you to do things should you decide to do that. So it's really about working with the school. And it might be that what the school has to do is to think about their fair processing notice to parents, so that parents understand in the event that we're going to engage with you about the Saltire Awards, we will pass this information on. So now is the time to do it when you're coming up to a new school year potentially from the next session. So I'm getting to dialogue with them. But the other aspect of GDPR, what it recognises here and what it's attempting to address is the use of social media essentially. And what it's saying under GDPR is that for children 13 and under, parental or guardian consent must be sought. So it's setting the bar at 13, as I say, that's the European level of understanding capacity. And it's saying that anyone under that age, it has to be parental consent. So if anyone's providing an online service to specifically targeted at children and young people, then if it's under 13, there has to be parental or guidance consent. So you need to think very carefully about how you're going to do that. How do you verify that? Data breaches. Currently, as you may or may not know, we have the power to impose what's known as a civil monetary penalty, a fine by any other name, of up to £500,000. Under GDPR, that's going to change. We will then have the power to fine. I always have to take a deep breath at this point because I find figures scary. It's a two-tier system, and depending on the nature of the breach and the level of severity and seriousness, it could be as much as €10 million. If it's really, really serious, it could be €20 million. That hurts, doesn't it? That really hurts. We would never ever fine an organisation to the extent that it put them out of business. And for the recent fines that we imposed on the various charities, British Heart Foundation, Red Cross, and the others, the Information Commissioner actually exercised her power of veto to bring those fines down. They were not the initial fines. The initial fines that our regulatory action process came up with was much, much higher. But in recognition of the fact that these were charities, she actually exercised her powers to reduce those fines, and they were bad enough as they were. But you also, under the new regime, whereas currently you don't need to tell us that you've had a breach, there's nothing mandating you to do that, or even mandating you to tell the individuals concerned that there's been a breach. Under the new regime, you will be mandated to inform us of any breach that could have a detrimental effect on an individual in terms of their rights and freedoms. So you have to get some process within your organisation that's going to enable you to do that. The likelihood it will be an online tool on our website, and I imagine it will be some kind of RAG report that will then at the end of it, you'll input information and it will tell you, yes, this is one that you need to formally notify us or not. We don't expect you to have the absolute details because this breach notification has to be done within 72 hours of first being made aware of a breach. Now, for a lot of people, you're not going to know what happened and you won't have done your investigation, but that's just about notifying us there has been a breach, you're undertaking an investigation, and you will come back to us at some point to give us the finer details. But it's quite fundamental now that part of your processes within your organisation enables people to say there's been a breach, and then for a system to kick in whereby at the end of that you determine whether it's something that we need to know about, and it has to be done within 72 hours of first being made aware of it. Privacy by design will become compulsory, so everything that you're doing that involves personal information, you will have to think about processing that using a privacy by design framework. What does that mean? It simply means recognising privacy risk. That's what that's about. And then ensuring that you're designing systems and processes, policies and procedures that are privacy friendly as much as possible. It doesn't say where there is a risk, don't do it. We understand that it's all about risk taking, that's what it's all about, but it's about mitigating that risk as much as possible. And then documenting why you've decided to move forward in a particular way and keeping that record. So privacy by design will become mandatory. You need to avail yourself of our guidance on that. Data protection officers for certain organisations, public authorities, will have to have a data protection officer put in place. For other organisations, it's about the amount of sensitive personal data or special category data you'll be processing. If you're processing a lot, the likelihood is you will need to have a data protection officer, or availing yourself of a data protection officer, maybe sharing between various organisations. It might be something that the SCBO, for example, might look at providing some kind of advice and guidance in that respect. Probably unlikely that you as organisations will need to have one, but our strong recommendation is that you at least have somebody that's a data protection lead and understands what's required. And then lastly, international is unlikely to affect any of you. This is for multinational organisations who need to determine where the supervisory authority is that they will be subject to. So just because an organisation happens to have a presence in the UK, for example, its main operations might be, let's say, in Brussels or in Dublin, and therefore you would choose to be regulated by the data protection lead or regulator in those countries rather than the UK. So again, that's not going to affect you guys. So, that's pretty good timing. Fundamentally, it's really about being prepared. So hopefully, those of you that put your hand up to say, yes, we started doing something, are giving yourselves a little tick, gold star, merit pass, pat in the back. And others are probably sitting there going, ah! And you'll take this back now to your organisations, hopefully, and let's see that being ratcheted up the agenda. If nothing else captures the mind of the senior management team, just quote figures about fines, and that will certainly make people sit up and take notice. Any further questions? Yes.
I have a different question. Can I just ask do we sync up with their questions first so we can all hear?
Sure, it was mentioned a little bit in terms of reviewing consent that's already been given. I'm interested to know about where you have ongoing relationships, either with clients, volunteers, organisations that you're working with. How much of a responsibility do you have if, how extensive does that review need to be in terms of the data that you have?
Remember that from data protection terms, it's about personal information, and so that's about individuals. it's not about organisational information, that's considered to be business information. So if the only information you're processing is Maureen Falconer at ICO.org.uk, that's my professional name, my professional business title, contact, then data protection is not something really you need to be thinking about too much, if that's the kind of information you're processing. So consent, no, it's just really about having a dialogue and having a good relationship, and it's good for you to have a good relationship with other organisations to keep them on board. Fair processing, keep people aware of what you're doing with their information. I've had someone say to me, for example, well, if someone gives me a business card, do I now have to give them all the fair processing and get their consent so I can put that business card onto my contacts list? And I'm going, no. Let's keep our logical heads and common sense heads on here, guys. If I give you my business card, I'm doing it in the expectation you'll contact me at some point. And so you don't need to have my consent in order to do that. But if you're processing personal information of individuals, then absolutely review how you've obtained consent and whether you could consider it to be freely given, unambiguous, fully informed, and a proactive means of getting consent. If you can say yes to that, fine. You don't need to go back and refresh. If you can say not sure, my strong advice is that you go back and refresh anyway. Very, very different.
I have a second question. In relation to the procedures that we would use organisationally, for example, how long we would retain information before we destroy it. So we can understand in relation to the new legislation what our responsibilities are. There's sometimes another layer where if we're contracted or funded by somebody else in relation to the retention of information, is it their responsibility if they're asking us to retain information to tell us the legal basis or the business reason that we need to retain it?
No, that's your responsibility, you and not you personally, your organisations. And basically, if you're being funded by someone, and very often third sector organisations are required to keep information because their funder says you have to keep it. Essentially, you're entering into a contract or contractual agreement in here. It might not formally be known as a contract, but it is a formal agreement that you have. And part of the condition of getting the funding is that you give them certain information or retain certain information, probably for auditing purposes, to prove that you are, getting a good demographic, the equality and diversity and all of that. And that's perfectly legitimate to keep that information. That becomes, your legal basis becomes a legal obligation under contract or under this memorandum of understanding, agreement, whatever it is. So it's your legal basis for doing it.
Thank you, that's very good.
Can I just ask on the business to business thing, just because the legal advice that we've got says there is no differentiation in the data protection legislation between business to business and business to consumer. So therefore, personal data, David McNeil of SCDO, is the same as, it should be treated equally as David McNeil of a home address. So is it, what we believe, so there will be no guidance around that? Because I suppose we all work with organisations, and therefore if you come along to a thing like this, we've not had a fair processing notice, we've got the minutes of the meetings that will then go online. That would technically take some time to get personal information. But some clear guidance, is there clear guidance that says that's okay?
No, there's no clear guidance yet, and I hold my hands up here, and I kind of caveated why there's no clear guidance yet, because there are so many external factors that will determine how our guidance actually looks. And I will tell you that it's unlikely that we will have any clear guidance out before summertime. It is highly unlikely, for all of the reasons that I've rehearsed already. But there is no doubt that in terms of business to business, or whether it's personal information of individuals that you're processing, that from our perspective there's a level of seriousness about information. And so you have to think about, well, what information do I have? What level is it here? Is it a business to business, in which case there's an expectation or less of an expectation about privacy when it's to do with a business? Or is it personal information where there's much more expectation in terms of individuals in relation to privacy issues? So whilst you're right, currently there's a bit of ambiguity around whether business information in terms of identifying an individual could be considered under data protection, whether it will come under the new regime. Currently it doesn't, it's very, very clear, but that could be something that the UK government gives us more guidance on and creates some kind of derogation around or excludes in some way. And so just now everything's a bit of a foggy landscape, but the best thing that I can say to you to do is to follow the 12 steps guidance and ensure that you're doing the best you possibly can, because that will certainly give you the foundation and the platform to make any tweaks that will be required once we get clearer guidance, both from us, from the UK government, and also from Europe itself under the Article 29 working group that's responsible for this. It might seem a bit unfair that what I'm saying to you just now is you have to comply, but we're not going to tell you right now exactly how to do that. I would only say to you, in my defence, Your Honour, as an organisation, as a data controller, we are in exactly the same boat. So we're no further forward than you guys are in terms of all this, and we're still trying to work out within our own organisation how we will be GDPR compliant. Feel sorry for us. I suppose just to say to you, finally, I don't know if I've got this in the very last slide, no I don't. Just finally, if you have any queries or questions, please log on to our e-newsletter, get signed up for that, because that's where you will hear about new guidance coming out first and foremost. We have a microsite that you can access via our website on the new regulation, and again you will get more guidance posted on that. There's also links there to external guidance that's coming from Europe itself. So that's how to stay up to date with all of this. It's a moving landscape, things will change. Even any guidance that we bring out now will change over the piece until May next year as more guidance comes out and things are explained. Okay.
So can I just say thank you.